Hello and welcome to the Grief Summit. I'm Sierra Campbell and I'm standing on the land of the Mohican in New York. Please drop in the chat the name of the indigenous belonging to the land that you stand upon today. Today, we address grief. Personally, I've worked in elder and hospice care for more than 20 years. This year of global grief has shown me the immense importance to listen, protect, and show up for our frontline providers. Over 2.5 million people worldwide have lost their lives to COVID-19. More have lost their jobs and homes. There are 65 plus million refugees in the world today. We're in a climate crisis, and economic injustice is driving people into greater poverty, racism, and so many other isms. 1 year ago, members of the Resilience Collective gathered and collaborated on creating resources for two crises facing our communities at this time: COVID-19 and racism. You can find our team link in the chat so you can see all of the current collective members. As a collective, our primary areas of focus are creating resources for resilience. We co-develop projects to promote collective resilience in scalable, meaningful ways. We work to advance equity and inclusion. We openly discuss power differentials and marginalization. Through these dialogues, we model transparency and accountability. We provide strategic consultation for select external projects. We support one another in developing initiatives that promote collective resilience, much like this Grief Summit. We hold space for ongoing reflection and evolution and actively engage in co-creation. We seek to advance social, economic, and racial justice. We include a multiplicity of voices and imaginations and believe in intersectional and participatory processes. Our work is relational, grounded in kinships, communities, and organizations. It centers around the collective, we. We build on existing strengths, values, resources, and connections, and we seek to be generative and adaptive. And ultimately, we understand problems and possibilities that arise from dynamic, interconnected systems. The Resilience Collective is a collaborative, a multidisciplinary network that we invite you into and want to thank you for showing up today. As we address grief, it is my hope for you in listening in and playing a part in this Grief Summit, that in the midst of all the uncertainty in your life right now and your family, that you find space in which to act and to show up together. Our first speaker, Roshi Joan Halifax, an activist, a pioneer in the field of end-of-life care, understands grief. Roshi Joan is a medical anthropologist, a Buddhist teacher, founder and head teacher of Upaya Institute and Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Upaya's mission is to provide a context for community practice, education in Buddhism, and social service in the areas of death and dying, prison work, the environment, women's rights, and peace work. Offerings at Upaya are primarily by donation and ideal for our time. Roshi Joan has written many books, including Being with Dying, Cultivating Compassion and Wisdom in the Presence of Death, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom, Where Fear and Courage Meet, Simplicity in the Complex, A Buddhist Life in America, The Human Encounter with Death, and The Fruitful Darkness. I have thought of this book often as we go through such intense times. In this book, Roshi Joan takes us on a wild journey of deep ecology where she meets Tibetan Buddhist meditators, elders of many tribes, and she finds herself in the Mayan rainforest and meeting Mexican shamans, and she's exploring wisdom from communities found in ritual, found together to build resilience. And we are at a time when we're forced to meet and mourn our immense losses in new ways. And here to talk with us on grief, thank you so much for being with us, Roshi Joan Halifax.
Thank you so much, Sierra. I'm very, very grateful to be here. You know, in these past days, there have been many articles about the experience that we're addressing today, and that is of grief and of loss. And I think that it is a time for us to work that edge, because I know from being in the end of life care field for many decades that grief is truly one of the most humanizing experiences that we can have. And yet, many of us don't allow ourselves to be enfolded by grief, to work grief, to learn from grief. I often recall the words of Terry Tempest Williams. She wrote, a good friend of mine said, "You are married to sorrow." And I looked at him and said, I am not married to sorrow. I just choose not to look away. So as Sierra was reminding us, we are in the middle of a really extraordinary and historic catastrophe. 500,000 or more have died of the coronavirus in our country alone. And, you know, the number is so huge, but each part of that number represents a loss, represents a field of grief, and represents a particular kind of suffering, not only for the dying individual and also not only for family members, but also for the clinicians, the nurses and doctors who have served those who have been afflicted with this virus. You know, we're in a time not only of the pandemic with this enormous global death toll, but also in the grip of an economic catastrophe with lockdowns and job losses and extraordinary pressure, particularly on people who are not affluent. And I think we have to consider those losses that have to do with our economy as also something that's priming grief. And then we're in a kind of big shift socially and culturally. For example, the pandemic has made clear the deep rifts related to the inequality related to race and poverty that exist in our culture here in the United States. But I say that this time is a crisis of heart and mind that goes right to the core of how we live as social beings, how we deal with failure, how we address moral suffering. And there has been great moral suffering in the years since this pandemic has struck our country, particularly the moral suffering experienced by clinicians in having to allocate limited resources or not allowing family members to attend the dying. Deep moral suffering. How we also address fear and how we address loss. And I believe that this pandemic also has a potential for profoundly influencing, for worse or better, how we die. Yet the losses and the sense of grief permeate in other ways through our culture. For example, our daily structure has been deeply disrupted. Our normal social contacts, the sense of connection, communication, being able to go out to dinner with friends, being in our job context where we can enjoy connection and relationship. Also, the sense of social safety is gone, another loss that we're experiencing. And then in addition, our inability to attend funerals, for example, or weddings or graduations, even returning to school, what kids have been through this year could have profound positive or not so positive effects on the experience of young people and their future. But there's also losses related to our sense of autonomy and predictability and normalcy. And as I said to one palliative care physician in Texas who was seeking normal, and I said, I don't know what normal will look like, but I just hope that it's a better normal. Still in the midst of this time of loss and grief. I believe also that we are grieving the passing of a way of life. As I said, the old normal is not something I think that we will be able to return to in a way that many of us wish we could. So we are in a very interesting situation. And Terry Tempest Williams addresses it, about bearing witness or really facing the truth of loss and the truth of grief and the truth of fear at scale. And this has been compounded by physical distancing and isolation. And perhaps many of you are not at the effect of this. I am not, because I live in a practice community. So I've had the benefit of this past year being in relationship with a pod of others who share practice together. But this situation that so many are in, and I hear this in my interviews with people all over the world, the sense of the loss of social connection has stirred up the deep knot of grief that had not been visible for to these individuals. And what is really astonishing to consider that at this time, around 2.6 billion people around the world are in lockdown. That's more people than were alive during World War II. And our governments, whether they're state or national governments, have basically told us to reduce our lives to the smallest element. And for many, that is just the household. So all I can say is that we as social animals are really deeply challenged, because our capacity to grieve deeply is often based on relationship, being held by others, being supported by others as we meet grief, and as grief fills our life and our consciousness. So what about grief? First, I want to say how important it is that we create the contexts where we allow ourselves to grieve, and that we work with grief in a wise and brave way, both individually and also collectively, also in relationship. I remember a quote says, "The fears we don't face become our limits." And this is about, of course, the griefs that we don't grieve become our limits as well. And many of the myths and stories and rituals that have given meaning to grief, that have provided the context for metabolizing grief, are no longer present in our culture. So it is a time for us to look at what kind of strategies are available to us to actually turn toward grief and to work it in a way that enhances resilience. And to understand that grief has many gifts to offer us, as hard as that may seem to many of us. First, as I mentioned before, grief is deeply humanizing. It has the potential to actually deepen our empathy and to increase our capacity for compassion and insight if we allow ourselves to work it. Also, our ability to face our fears, our ability to grieve deeply can be supported when we draw upon and when we share the myths, the stories, the rituals and practices that are part of our community. Yes, we grieve what we care about. I heard a line from a song, I think, or one of my students shared this with me. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. So I want to go back to these words of Terry Tempest Williams. She writes, "There is deep beauty in not averting our gaze. No matter how hard it is, no matter how heartbreaking it can be, it is about presence. It is about bearing witness." And then she writes, "I used to think that bearing witness was a passive act, but I don't believe that anymore. I think that when we are present, when we bear witness, when we do not divert our gaze, something is revealed, the very marrow of life. We change. A transformation occurs. Our consciousness shifts." Such powerful words from her. Not avert our gaze. And at the same time, it's being aware in this journey of grief that many of us are going through, that things could get worse before they get better. But they're also, it's important to trust that we can move through sorrow toward a life that is characterized by thriving, by resilience, if we have the means to meet our suffering, to meet grief, to meet sorrow with patience and also with curiosity, as well as wisdom. And we have to keep in mind, this is not easy. It's a wonderful book by Pat Barker. In this, it's a novel called Regeneration. And she writes of a doctor who knew only too well how often the early stages of change or cure may mimic deterioration. And she writes, "Cut a chrysalis open and you will find a rotting caterpillar. What you will never find is that mythical creature, half caterpillar, half butterfly, a fit emblem for the human soul, for those whose cast of mind leads them to seek such emblems. And then she writes, no, the process of transformation consists almost entirely of decay. Whoa. I think she's right. As I've said in other contexts, I feel we are going through a global rite of passage. And it is teaching us that loss is a natural part of life. So I'd like to mention a few ways that we can work with grief. One is to understand that grief is a relational experience. And in other societies, and I know this as an anthropologist, grieving and mourning are shared experiences. Being transparent about our losses, being transparent about our brokenheartedness can actually lessen the impact, the adverse impact of sorrow or grief on us. Also, I really encourage us to explore how our ancestors grieved and worked with grief. You know, every culture has a really rich and a really deep history of rituals of transformation. Are there rituals of transformation within our own society that would serve? And if not, can we look into our history and revive those rituals, revive those stories, revive those rites that give meaning to the process of transformation? Or we can create new rituals to deal with both collective and individual loss. One of the things that I found so helpful is to actually create a memorial, whether it's a memorial garden, a memorial corner, a small altar. Just as in our zendo at Upaya, on the right side of the altar are the names of those in our community who are ill. And on the left side of the altar are the names of those who have died. And it reminds us of our mortality, the truth of impermanence. And it also reminds us of how precious this moment is just as we're experiencing it. I want to just mention a few more possibilities or strategies. You know, in this time of Zooming, even elders, the older people like me, are learning how to work with Zoom. And Zoom provides a context, since many of us cannot meet face-to-face, to actually share stories about persons that we have been close to, who have died. And that sense of connection, whether it's through Zoom or face-to-face, really makes a difference, can really be a very healing process for both the speaker and for the listener. I want to mention two other things: how important forgiveness is in the experience of grief. Forgiving someone who has harmed you. Perhaps that person is the person who's died, and you have felt betrayed, enraged, disappointed, brokenhearted, and to forgive that person. And as well, forgiving yourself for mistakes made and things left undone. And to understand also the value of gratitude. I remember, as my own father was in the process of active dying, he was flailing, and it was literally a few hours before the moment of his death. I put my hands on either side of his head, and his arms were flying, and his skin on his forearms are so thin, they were just, his arms were bleeding, and it was really a pretty heavy scene. And I put my hands on either side of his head, and I just said, "Thank you, Daddy. Thank you. Thank you." Just as a way to express incredible gratitude for all that he gave me. And then when I was there for his last breath, I was able to, in the silence of prayer, to send that this great heart of gratitude to my father. Gratefulness is a really powerful force of healing in the experience of grief. So whether it's a grief walk with a friend, a grief Zoom, whether it's parallel play where, you're on Zoom, but your friend who's grieving is reading and you're painting or writing a haiku, the sense of connection, companionship is very helpful. And finally, meditation. This is my thing, I think many of you know, that there are deep practices that support the cultivation of stability, of openness, of insight, of courage, of groundedness, and of compassion that make it possible for us to become more resilient in the process of the journey of grief. So I want to just say a few more things. People who have faced grief deeply and who've had the support of a community or of another have often come back profoundly transformed by the experience, where suffering has in fact made them more resilient rather than more fragile, and with the ability to actually thrive in the present instead of being overwhelmed by the past. We can look at this in terms of the experience of positive integration of trauma. And what I'm saying by this is that beyond the ending of the old way of life that we experience, there is a kind of possibility for a new life to emerge. And that we can actually imagine a future where our wounds are still there, but in a form that connects us and makes us wiser and humbler and helps us to thrive. I think of Nelson Mandela or Malala or Jimmy Carter. They thrived, but they also encountered incredible obstacles, incredible losses in their life. I think of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who lost his family, who lost his country. Thich Nhat Hanh, the same. And yet out of that experience of facing the truth of grief, this extraordinary power of presence has opened, and a sense of purpose has unfolded. So I want to finish this talk on grief with some words from the poet Wendell Berry. Wendell's an old friend of mine, Kentucky poet. And he writes about an old sycamore tree that is near his house. And he says of it, fences have been tied to it, nails driven into it, hacks and whittles cut in it. Lightning has burned it. There is no year that it has flourished in that has not harmed it. It has risen to a strange perfection in the warp and bending of its long growth. It has gathered all accidents into its purpose. It has become the intention and radiance of its dark fate. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts and perspectives with you about the power of presence, of bearing witness to, of not turning away from, not being lost in addiction, not being lost in denial in relation to the truth of the losses that we're experiencing as a society and as individuals. And the possibility, as Wendell has suggested, it has become the intention and radiance of its dark fate that we may awaken to a life that is deeper, kinder, and more purposeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshi Joan. We have some questions. Pertinent question is, this is from Jill, how do you address those who still deny the pandemic? Do you pray for them, and what happens if they're in your family?
Yes, this is a wonderful question. I'm probably a little like the Dalai Lama. I'm not sure about prayer, but when I pray, it helps me, if you know what I'm saying. But I think part of our work is reaching across the divide in relation to differences. And again, going back to Terry Tempest Williams' words, it is to presence whatever their denial is. It's to connect in a way of respect. It's not to try to change people's minds, because people's minds don't change that way. I think that minds and hearts change through connection. And so trying to discuss it probably is not going to work, but I think what works is respect and love.
Beautiful. And here's a question about numbness. This is from Sarah. How do you really kind of figure out, deal with the grief and loss of known structures, support, normalcy of everything when it has become so overwhelming that you just feel numb? How can you increase the capacity to allow when the only feeling is numb?
I think that our numbness is one of the ways, if it's not induced, for example, by alcohol or other addictive behaviors, it's a way that we actually protect ourselves for a period of time. So I just encourage people to be patient with their numbness and to resource themselves so that their sense of feeling and connection can come alive again. I work with many clinicians, and the trauma that clinicians face in dealing with the pandemic is just incredible to, I can't even imagine. I receive every day. I'm in conversation, or I'm reading emails from clinicians who are just wiped out and who have gone numb. They've just shut down completely. And this is how we protect ourselves. And it's not to beat on ourselves more, but it's actually to say, okay, I'm so disconnected. I can't feel anything. This is my mindfulness bell, so to speak, that I need to resource myself. And that is to allow an exhale or to do something that is in fact nourishing and reviving of my psyche and of my spirit.
A lot of questions around for those who work in death every day. Hard to keep your head up and really keep showing up. Talk to us about how to keep showing up.
Our bodies are really great teachers. Number one, following every inhale, there's an exhale. And so, keep showing up means not keep showing up necessarily in the midst of the chaos, but it's showing up to actually what will resource ourselves as clinicians. And whether it's a moment of mindful breathing, whether it's humor between clinicians, whether it's actually sitting down with a family member and being completely connected to that family member who is trying to figure out what to do, but just being fully present instead of, being in the sort of high emergency jacked up mode. But resourcing ourselves and understanding the problems associated with two things that I want to mention. One is pathological altruism, feeling like we're the only ones who can ever do good, and we have to stay there and sacrifice ourselves on the altar of service. In the meantime, we're circling around the drain. And empathic distress, that is over-identification with the individual who's suffering, such that we end up dissociating and in a way decompensating ourselves, or going into, in the way of numbness, the other end of the continuum, into objectification in order to defend ourselves from the experience of perceiving other suffering. So we have to be very somatically attuned. We have to take care of the body. We have to be respectful of our practical needs. We have to learn how to ground ourselves, and we have to really study how compassion operates, which is one of the things that we teach at Upaya, which I think is so important, and that's the grace practice of gathering your attention, recalling your intention, attuning first to yourself and then others, and then considering what will serve, and then from that, engaging.
Thank you, Roshi Joan. We have a few more questions. This is a tough one. This is from Yasamin. This week, a 10th grader, a beloved child, took her life in our community. This is one of the hardest, when perhaps turning towards grief needs extra tenderness, the depths of which are unknown for the parents, the community. Would you please share wisdom on incredible tender times, especially around suicide and the loss of children?
I'm going back again to Terry Tempest Williams. I don't think words assuage. I don't think words often serve, but presence does. And people need, if you will, the grandmother arms of presence, without feeling this kind of fakey, defensive grief talk that sometimes we engage in because we can't figure out anything to do, because we don't trust presence. And what can you say when a child takes his or her life? There are not words that suffice. Truly, I cannot imagine any words. but being able to actually stay present with those whom are grieving, also with our own experience, in a way that acknowledges loss and also is deeply respectful of the manifestations of sorrow, confusion, and even anger, as well as anguish that is associated particularly around the experience of suicide.
Mhm.
I think the other piece is, understanding that young people are very stressed at this time. And, again, I'm prayer, I think, is helpful. It brings a sense of the sacredness of life and death. And so whether it's prayer in our own experience or the sharing of prayer or offering prayer to the one who has taken his or her life. And with this sort of background of forgiveness, because our society in a certain way failed and is failing many of our young people.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, a
asking
lot of
the priest for forgiveness. Yeah.
a lot of questions around how to communicate with children and also to expand on forgiveness and what does it really mean to resource oneself?
So those are three questions. So let me start with communicating with children. I think the best way to communicate with children is through play. And so that's, in the home where grief is present, it's also, it's normalizing loss, impermanence. It's normalizing death. It's to create the sense that this is normal. This is how people experience loss. And all of us will die. It's taking kids out into the natural world, the passing of the seasons, the dead animal by the road, the rose bush that has withered in the fall. So, it's like using story, play, examples in the natural world, and to normalize what it is to experience death and loss. So that's one piece. The other thing you asked about was resourcing ourselves. We often have a bias toward negative narratives. So, we're constantly ingesting the sorrowful, the sad, the pitiful, the loss, the unhappiness, we're sort of in the stew of misery. And I remember a friend of mine who went to Thailand after the great tsunami and worked with people there. She was a very skilled psychologist. And her whole family was swept away, and she was the only person who survived. And she was completely traumatized and totally in grief. And the psychologist bore witness to that part of her narrative. And then she asked, well, what else? What else? How did you survive? And how she survived was pretty remarkable. The wave had tossed her into the top of a palm tree. And the palm tree had stayed upright, and she had survived the tsunami. And the psychologist helped her to understand that actually she had a resource. That moment was a moment that was a kind of mitzvah or blessing. And so resourcing ourselves is not just dwelling in the painful narrative, but it's to understand, what I do. I often teach about things that are very tough to deal with. But I also step outside of my little room here, and I take a walk in the natural world. Or I get down on the floor and hug my dog. Or I have a good laugh with one of my students. You know, I have to have these exhales. And that kind of balance becomes obvious to me when I attend to my body. And actually, after this talk, I'm going for a walk. Because I realize part of how I am resourced is by being in the natural world. But it could be picking up your baby or holding your grandchild or having a Zoom with a grandparent.
There's a question on alone time and grieving and solitude. And I know that you are an extreme introvert and solitude can be very nourishing for you, but talk with us about grief and solitude.
Well, every stick has two ends. So I think solitude for those who are designed for it, like myself, it's really nourishing. I really appreciate the absence of structure and not having to interact as much as I do with people because of my job. So, you know, again, that's a resource for me, but it's not for everyone. And, you know, I was talking about this kind of parallel play on Zoom. You know, sometimes just, you know, having a friend on your screen while you're reading a book, that's a presence there. It's a sense of connection. Or I'll be writing a haiku and, you know, someone else will, you know, could be doing calligraphy, or I'll do the calligraphy and they'll write the haiku. So, you know, connection is important and you have to know when it works for you. And also solitude for some is essential, but you have to know how it works for you. And then there are people, many people out there today who actually are not thriving in solitude at all. So I don't make it a prescription of that is except for a few strange ones like myself.
Something that is, I don't know if it's a new program at Upaya, but your socially engaged Buddhism program. Can you close with that? Because I find that it really is at the intersection of community addressing racism together.
Last fall, that all of this work that I've done around socially engaged Buddhism and this network of individuals internationally that I collaborate with, that it was important to now start a training in socially engaged Buddhism. And we did it, and it is really extraordinary. I mean, you know, it is addressing issues related to climate, race, prison, sexism, ageism, and all from a contemplative base, from a Buddhist perspective, but also understanding there are two main streams in socially engaged Buddhism. One is social service, and that's what something I've been involved in for many decades, and that is direct work with, for example, in the prison system, or with dying people, or with the unsheltered, or people in the Himalayas who don't have access to health care. So it's direct service. The other is social action, and that is addressing issues related to structural violence. That is the actual systems and institutions that cause suffering to groups of individuals, like people of color and people who have certain special abilities and so on. And so both of these streams are braided because they reflect harm in our institutional systems and the outcome of harm, for example, those in our correctional system, or harm in our medical system. It's both structural and the need for a certain kind of service. For example, we have a chaplaincy training program. It's incredible. But every doctor should be a chaplain, in my opinion. Every nurse should have the skills of a chaplain.
Mhm. Yeah, everyone really needs to have that basic education of death and dying.
Exactly. Anyway,
Roshi Joan,
thank you so much, Sierra, for putting this amazing event together and for your work. I'm so grateful. And I hope you come to Upaya one day.
I look forward to it. It's going to be one of my first trips when we bust out of lockdown. Thank you, Roshi Joan.
Thank you so much.